Good day. I'm Elementary 72. Now, I do run a gaming channel, and it was my hope that one day I'd have um, enough followers or enough people listening to what I'm saying to actually have some impact. But this is actually a private video. It's a shareable link, so if anybody gets it, they can share it as much as they want. If anybody sees it on my channel and they feel that it's not a part of what I'm about, you can ignore this video, but here goes. This video is about saving our environment. Now, obviously, saving the environment is an important topic. It's an international topic, it's worldwide, and a lot of people propose some really scary stuff like changing our lifestyles around drastically, stop supporting our fast food habits, and stop supporting TVs and laptops and all these things. However, if we want a good solution, we have to have a solution that's flexible enough to incorporate these things into it. Obviously, there's a certain point where it stops being flexible and it will have some very bad ramifications. I already worked my own plan out for this, and it's up to whoever watches it and whoever spreads it out further to say whether or not they can make an impact with it. And I hope that it someday reaches somebody's somebody's ears who can actually do something about this here. So let's go over what I have thought of. So saving the environment is a multi-part problem. We have global warming and we have land reclamation problems. Now, the first problem is that we're expanding our carbon footprint way too far. The carbon footprint, if it passes a certain point and the temperature hits a tipping point, our vegetation will actually start joining in the carbon emissions situation, and we'll stop having the positive impact of the trees to help us out. At that point, any initiative like Go Green or plant a tree for every car made is actually going to be counteracting us. That's if all the science is 100% correct, because I have watched quite a bit of these things. I've learned as much as I could about it before I decided to make something this big as a proposal. So that is the first thing that we have a problem with. The second thing is we have an alarming growth rate of our population. Our populations are growing at alarming rates. Our developmental skills are slowing down due to socio problems. And this here is something which is very big and very influential on this entire situation. It also has to be addressed in this year as well. So please just bear with everything that has to be said in this year, because some of it, as I said, it means that sacrifices have to be made if we want to have a tomorrow to even talk about. And once everything has been sorted out and the world is out of this environmental catastrophe and the next catastrophe is looming with another 600 to 700 years to go, we can start talking about all of our social problems without a problem, and we can start thinking about moving forward in those manners. So here goes the first thing. Okay, so to sustain our environment's O2 purposes, we need to create forests. If we're going to create forests, that means we're going to have to reclaim land. We're going to have to reclaim deserts. We're also going to have to start finding ways to do agriculture more efficiently. Seasonal farming is non-efficient, and it also provides a lot of destruction to the environment. Although it does help a little bit with that CO2 buffer, it's also helping against it in a way, because we have to destroy forests to reclaim land for farming, and that is a whole other situation which is making it unlovable. We also then have another situation on that same path which is also impacting, as I'm about to explain, they all impact each other in different ways, where we actually expand our civilization and we take up fields that were once grassy, we take up big beautiful landscapes and we fill them with houses. Low-rise building or single-story building, or houses as we would call them, are actually non-efficient ways of living. As a result, they also have massive negative effects on the greenhouse emissions. We can actually see a negative flow with that there if you're counting it in the manner, because you lose that area of plants. And it may not seem like a lot, but when you have a 10-kilometer piece of land, I'm using the metric system for this year, a 10-kilometer by 10-kilometer piece of land that has a house everywhere and 1/3 of it is actual development, plus all the trees that were lost in the area and everything that was lost. And now you have pools in people's backyards, which is taking out another big chunk. And let's say that overall 50% of that land is lost from the ability to produce greenhouse gases. Then we have roads, we have infrastructure that's added to the area that also reduces it. Then we have people walking through greenways and pathways that are formed outside of the natural environment that kills vegetation. Adding on to the impact, it may seem small in the individual purpose, but it becomes bigger and bigger as we go along. So as I said, there are some sacrifices that would be needed with my stuff as I go along, but talking about the problem in the start is the first part. The next thing is our ability to produce jobs is also a crucial piece of the puzzle. If we don't produce jobs, people turn to nature to make up their living, and if people turn to nature to make up their living, they end up reconstituting the very problem we're trying to stop. So by a person not being able to make money and just live, he's going to end up going to a forest, building a log cabin, living off the land directly, killing a couple trees. May not seem like a lot, but when the figure starts churning out more and more people, and it goes from 30 or 40 people to a few thousand, then a couple 100,000 and a million people, the impact looks drastically more horrible than it actually should be. And that is where the problem starts to churn up, which is why those things are being addressed in my complete solution. Now, when my solution is discussed, here's one thing: I'll take a single problem and I'll give it possible solutions for a start. Then I'll outline the secondary functions on it and how you can spread it to the next function. So any one of the functions that I list are going to be interlinked to join all of those functions together at later stages. Obviously, there's a lot of planning that goes into these things. It's not going to be something that can just easily be implemented. And to be honest, there may be 3 or 4 people in the entire world who can actually make an impact on this here. Some governments may have the ability to, but as I'm about to explain, the first world countries aren't really our solution to a global warming situation, because they already have complex systems in place. And by trying to go too far down a green path, they can end up hurting their economies and losing people's jobs, and anything which churns up those types of effects generally has a negative effect on the lower line. Plus, they have heavy social impacts where they are lobbying for affirmative actions and social justices, which doesn't really look for the best of the best for a field. It looks for a unilateral equities outcome at the end of it. So, for example, if we had everything done with environmental scientists, if we had the world's top 100 working on a project versus an equitable group of scientists, there's no guarantee that we're going to get the same result. The top 100 would definitely give us a far better chance at a good result. The equitable group could give us multiple variations of results, but there's a stronger chance we're not going to get the best out of it. It's a strong possibility if you do that, which is why these projects won't be able to be affirmative action or equities based. It's one of the things you have to be able to sacrifice to actually go ahead with something on these bounds. Now, crying for a government to actually make these changes isn't really going to help. You can riot, you can do whatever you want. The cost that you inflict on the government by rioting is insignificant. The cost to yourself is much higher. You actually end up hurting yourself more than helping yourself by rioting or holding demonstrations overall. You can band together and try and help initiatives. That's always going to help you, but trying to force the governments to actually care about the environment and the people who they've promised to protect and the goals they have promised to reach isn't going to help anybody. The governments are as good as any other company. They're just a company who is there to regulate the people. You can say it in any other way. They don't make a profit. They make a living out of it. Their livings are substantial. They're not basic livings. To be honest, the only person I can ever say who was there for the benefit of the people would be a president who didn't take a substantial sum of money. Unfortunately, there is an example, but he wasn't that really loved as a president. That's my political view on that, and I'm going to stop at that. So let's move forward to what we need to do to actually work on these plans. So we have multiple sources of green energy. We have companies like Tesla who are looking to use electricity as our means of moving forward, and we can produce electricity without producing greenhouse gases. Solar energy is a viable solution. However, relying on it primarily requires a lot of land. Once again, we land into the reclamation issue. So solar isn't 100% the best. So let's move on to the next. Wind power requires land reclamation, not really the best. Tidal power, fantastic idea. Unfortunately, not all places are capable of using tidal power. However, there are solutions to tidal power where we can use tidal power to generate a fuel from water to actually then power up stations that are non-coal burning but a water burning facility, otherwise known as hydrogen fuel cells, to generate the power in other areas. It has a substantial cost, but everything can be worked out in infrastructure with a significant amount of time added to that whole picture, which is also a very big situation to try and discuss. But more importantly, whatever we try to do in the start needs to have a knock-on effect for those who can actually make this effect. So that's going to be companies like Tesla, companies like Amazon. Anything that's that big is actually going to be where we're going to get our effect. Now, let's talk about this in the most simple form factor. So if we're going to do this here, as I said, tidal power is one of our best options. As I said, wind requires land reclamation. We already said there's a problem with it because we have to reforest, and we don't want to deforest in the process. And we need to think of a long-term solution that's going to keep helping us. And tidal power isn't always 100% functional. Neither is hydroelectric. They do have environmental effects. One of the tidal power projects that I've seen which has a minimal effect is called a CETO. It actually removes fresh water from the ocean, restoring salt water balances to the ocean. There is CETO from Synergy or Surgy Power from Australia. They have one of the best technologies I've seen for this purpose, and it's actually around the technology that a lot of my ideas base outwards. So if you develop their technology in the right manner, you can actually make a lot of power. However, the fuel making part of this, the creating hydrogen for hydrogen fuel cells, is actually not so efficient. It's actually a highly inefficient method, but it's a very renewable method. The power that we gain and the power that we lose, they balance off on each other because they don't have any impact on the environment. It's not like we're creating hydrogen fuel out of petrol or any of those sources. We're using pure electricity made green, and we're converting half of it over to waste and half of it over to fuel, and we're using that to then power up our societies later down the line and move along with that. So that's one of the reasons why I consider it to be a positive. There is no negative knockoff on it. Batteries, they still require a lot of impact. Their lifespans are limited, and when they are depleted, there is no way of restoring them. Their fuel source is the lithium, and lithium oxide being scattered around, we're going to eventually have to try and reconstitute our sands and filter our sands and process our sands to get our resources back out. That's a long process down the line. It becomes really difficult. On the same side as hydrogen fuel cells, there are a lot of resources that can be used in hydrogen fuel cells. Their lifetimes are longer, if not as long as a lithium ion battery. And the other positive on those same fuel cells are that you can always recreate them out of other materials, moving along a certain line of creation. It's only a buy time method for you to move forward slightly, and eventually you'll get the whole gist of where my project goes. Now, obviously, this isn't yet profitable. I just spoke about the method of generating power so that we can actually keep our current lifestyles without losing too much. Is there a negative impact from this? Yes, there's a job loss situation if you allow this here to be implemented solely, because you'd be removing things like coal mining and oil drilling as a primary function. You need to replace those functions so that companies would have a good reason to do the employment situation to ensure that the socio-economics don't favor the fall of society. Obviously, I'm making it sound a lot simpler than it is, but there's a lot involved in this that even I can't discuss in a 6 or 12 hour video if I were to go that long. I'm hoping that this doesn't go anywhere near that far. Okay, so we now have our solution for generating power, a possible generation of fuel. How would we use this here to reclaim land? We have deserts in the world, especially in the third world. One first world country has a nice big portion of desert. That is, Australia is the first world. Provided the Aboriginal people are willing to have the environment reclaimed within their land and move throughout their land with a nice environment reclamation and some positive growth of cities within their area, this year would be a viable solution. If they choose not to, then that first world situation will not occur. And obviously, that is one of the best solutions if we ever had to go to a first world. However, the next option would be somewhere like the coast of South Africa. We have the Kuru Desert in the South African region. I am from South Africa. It's one of the nice sized deserts. It's big enough that it will give you a desert's impact, and it's also not populated enough that it's going to cause too many negative effects if anything happens in that region. Also, South Africa's natural resources are really on a decline. Our agriculture is on the decline, so any type of positive development will create jobs in this region. That's also another reason why it looks so positive for this particular region, this particular place. It is an unclaimed piece of land in the desert, so it's really a good place to start off with these projects. But this still isn't the ideal location. The ideal location would be the west coast of the Saharan desert. Now, I know this here is a massive place to talk about. We're talking about upwards of the inner coast of the southern part of the desert. We're talking about the western coast of the desert, moving towards the northwestern coast that's close to Europe. The reason is those are some of the biggest arid areas, and if you can implement it in an arid water coast and help the societies who live there with minimum amounts of people, your projects can become sustainable over time. You can actually reclaim a lot of land, and people won't really be that opposed to what you are doing because you're actually helping them instead of hurting them in any way. Even with the equities or equalities acts being nullified in those regions, the end of effect of these projects will actually counteract it if you do it in the right way, which I'm getting to as I go along. So we've identified possible locations to actually try these things. Once they have been implemented and several years go down, it can be implemented in first world countries when they see positive results, because they have to see a profit to invest in it. Count any government as a financial entity, and you can actually see when they will take part in a project. Okay, so there's my first rambling on. Let's go on to the next part of it. Okay, reclaiming forests and lands. Now, that is a very noble solution to try and aim for, but if you aim for it purely on its own without solving the problem of food, so if you don't reclaim enough land for food, people are unhappy, and if you reclaim a forest, they're going to reclaim the forest later for the sake of food. So you have to find a way to produce food. Now, this is the first problem that has to be solved, and this is where profitability starts to be added. Now, obviously, the costing on these projects are a bit in the negative, and they do turn positive over time. They are time-based evaluations, and they're not in-the-moment evaluations, so they make things quite difficult to actually analyze for this very purpose. Now, one of our best solutions in the modern world to area control and gaining more area out of a single plot of land is building high rises or building skyscrapers. So building tall buildings is one of the best things that we can do for solving the problem of land. But we need land that can grow plants. We do have a solution for this here. It's called hydroponics or aquaponics, that actually produces 2 or 3 types of food out of that one system. So you have a single system that produces 2 or 3 things at the same time. It produces oxygen, it produces food, it produces enough positive out of it, and since it's of a green source, you're not negatively impacting the CO2 situation. You're removing fresh water from the ocean, so you're not impacting animals, livestock, or forest water supplies. You see it, everything is now starting to balance a little bit on the ecological side, and in terms of a profit, you're actually going to be generating products which you can then sell and use, and you can employ people to look after these facilities, and that's where your profitability starts. Now, unfortunately, in the start, you need highly trained professionals, and you can bring in juniors later down the line once things are efficiently being produced. You need to make sure that you can produce basic crops. You need to make sure that you can produce advanced crops, and that is something that you have to do. Intermediate is in between. It's something which you will also introduce into these buildings. Now, considering a building is 10 stories high or 20 or even 30, I know that 50-story buildings aren't that hard to build in terms of engineering, but going anywhere near that 50 story does have its own difficulties added. So I'm going to cut it off at 50 stories as my calculation. If you locate a 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer piece of land with a 50 kilometer building construction plan situated inside it, in terms of the amount of land that you gain just making it 50 stories up, it would be 1 kilometer times 50. Obviously, there's a reduction from the amount of concrete that's inside the structure. There's the amount of space that you lose by segregating places for the health of the plants. There's electronic cables and infrastructure that's installed into the buildings that also reduces your efficiency. But let's go 50 floors up. At 50 floors, what you then gain out of everything is you gain 50 kilometers of land out of 1 kilometer of reclaimed land. Now, that is a piece of land that's in the desert that's not producing any oxygen, it's not producing any CO2, it's absolutely idle. You've now changed it into a food producing outlet that's producing oxygen, and it's also helping with generating an income for people. It means that you don't have to reclaim 50 kilometers of land out there. Obviously, there is some error of calculation on it. I'd say that it's actually half, so it's 25 kilometers of total land reclamation in 1 kilometer. So yeah, you get 25 kilometers of land worth of edible land that you had gained out of that project, and that is just for a phase one. If you're going to plan that out, 25 kilometers in the first settlement that you develop. Obviously, you can't only reclaim a desert the size of Sahara with a single plant. If you're doing something like Kuru, you can do it with a single plant. However, building it up to its maximum, it would be a 10 by 10 for the sake of agriculture. So 10 by 10, so that you have enough resources being produced in there. The amount of land that you're gaining is unbelievable. You can control environmental situations within the building. However, that releases CFCs, carbon fluorocarbons, which are emitted to destroying the environment. Obviously, there are less dangerous gases, but they're far more inefficient. They use more power. Might have to use that in those situations. So less efficient means, because you're using pure green energy. Everything being green in that situation would be better over the higher efficiency, even though it means you're consuming a little bit more power. As we develop our technologies and get things more towards the green side and non-environmentally heavy, that will become more and more positive. And if we can work on other things in that situation, things become even better. Now, that solution says that you can't just count on one CETO in the ocean. You're going to need quite a number of CETOs. The amount of electricity generated is going to be about the same amount as a city, so about 45 to 50 megawatt hours of power need to be generated from the CETO. The amount of water that's going to come in will be excess regardless. The plants lose a very small amount of power in controlled very small amount of water in the controlled environments. And you also have water flowing, so you can use its inefficient heat transfer properties to actually regulate your temperature a little bit instead of using gas regulations. So yeah, that's another negative positive way of looking at it. So yeah, there's multiples to look at on that side. Now, moving from this, if everything works out the way it goes, the way it should, and we get harvests of wheat and corn and tomatoes, potatoes, everything out of these situations. Obviously, everything can be produced in hydroponics and aquaponics and in-house greenhouses. That means some of them would actually have land in them, just because you need that for the greenhouse for certain plants, because they need soil. If you can actually do that there, you're going to have a fantastic overall situation. Some plants have to be naturally picked from the ground on the outside. They have to be looked after like that. They are their own story. They will not be added to this whole situation. But you can control these environments quite well. Then you're obviously thinking about the effects of pesticides, farmicides, and all these things. Obviously, you want to keep these crops as safe as possible from the impact of insects. You can keep the environment clean. To the best of your ability, you can look after them with natural means if it is possible. You can use organisms like wasps to protect the inlets of your air. Obviously, that's a whole other solution. It's a natural solution, but it's dangerous because the hornets could get killed. You can use bees for looking after the plants inside. However, that's also risky because bees don't do well inside enclosed spaces. Bumblebees do well inside enclosed spaces, so they might be a solution for that for natural pollinators. That makes it a little bit dangerous for humans. They have a tendency to bump into us and leave a little bit of a lump on your skin. It's non-deadly as far as I know, but yeah, they might be the solution for those types of environments. Okay, now I've given a profitable solution. Obviously, if you're working it out, hectares of land and profitability, you're looking at a couple 100,000 per hectare of land, and when all of this is added, you're looking about $1 million to a kilometer. And I said there's 25, and that means that you're making about $25 million dollars worth of profit from this location. Now, what is the time in which the plants grow? In greenhouses, they grow much more efficient. The efficiency of the plants to grow in greenhouses is a lot higher. So you're looking at smaller time frames than their natural environment. So plants that would take 3 months to fruit will be fruiting in around 2 months. So you're looking at about 6 times that figure. So if you're looking at it at $1 million per floor times 6, that's 6 million. 6 million times 25. You get it. It's not super affordable. It is a profit, and it does generate some income and can become sustainable over time, just like any building. I guarantee you a skyscraper that is 50 stories high doesn't produce the money that it took to invest in it in a single day. It's what develops around it that actually generates most of the money and eventually leads to the project becoming a positive. So if you're looking at it, a single building of that of the construction that I'm talking about will cost you a few $100 million to build. Inside that type of area or space that I'm talking about, you're talking about hundreds of buildings, so that's billions of dollars that are going to go into it. Maybe tens of billions, maybe hundreds of billions. Either way, it is a substantial figure that will go in to complete the project. So the project has to be done in pieces, and you can move it forward piece by piece if you know how to incrementally increase it. Now, as I said, we as a society are claiming land on two fronts. One is for the purpose of farming, the other is for the purpose of living. Now, when you create a working environment far away from cities, that means transport becomes the issue. So you're going to have to accommodate people living in this area. You're going to look for people who are going to look after your plants. That's going to be your first generation of business. Then you're going to need people who have to look after your people. So you're going to look at supermarkets, all forms of industry forming around it, education. You get it. Everything starts to increase as you go. And when you create the 10-kilometer wide area, your profit margins on the other side become higher. You don't have transport as such a major impact on this entire situation. Everything starts to decline in the cost of living for this particular little city that you're in. So it becomes a very cheap living environment. However, it's also a very sophisticated living environment because it's a high-tech development, because you want to keep the lifestyles of people intact in there. So high amounts of technology, high amounts of power, fresh water, and your CETOs are going to have to generate more and more power eventually because you're going to have large cities depending on it. Honestly, a 25-kilometer stretch of land most probably could support about a 10-kilometer settlement in a year. I'm not even sure about that estimation. I think it's more like a 1-kilometer settlement, but yeah, that's just what I'm going off. And if you count the amount of people who can live in a 1-kilometer high-rise settlement, that is where things go straight through the roof, because you can accommodate millions of people in that small environment. And if you keep accommodating people in that small environment, you end up winning. Now, the next part is actually going to be, now that we've stopped people from having to have to expand out and take more of the environment, how do we help the environment around this project? Because that is the whole objective of it. And I'm just going to say this here. This does not solve the problem. This just prolongs the end of the problem. we may be impacting the global temperature increase to the point where it becomes zero point zero 0.01 increase a year or 0.001 a year, but we still need to make positive knock-on effects so that the greenhouse effect eventually drops. This isn't a pure green solution. There are some positive green effects that come out of it. The excess oxygen production means that a lot of carbon is being captured and eaten by us in the forms of food. When we start reclaiming the forest, that carbon is stored in the forests. The amount of power that's being used to look after the forest becomes another solution down the line. I did say that there was a fuel possibility out of it, so we do find solutions for alternate fuels. This isn't a viable solution for the long-term future of the world, even though it may look that way. The reason is, as I'm about to explain, when we take out the one fuel system, we knock on the profit of that industry. If we use the second fuel system and everybody jumps on board and everybody starts producing it, they're going to want prices to go up over time. It means prices will go up and then people will turn back to the fossil fuels. It's the way that the world goes every single time anything is introduced. Example, solar power was really expensive in the start. It's coming down in price, and as soon as it started to come too low and affect the earnings of governments, taxes were introduced on people installing full electric systems that are solar based, and charges were introduced onto them for connecting it up to the grid because they aren't using enough power to be counted as a main contributor to the profits of the companies. So you get it, people do punish you for going green. So yeah, that's just that part of the story. Now on the reclamation part, we have a society of people who would be living right there on the doorstep of where our project will start. We actually need something from them, and that's human waste. I am saying it exactly as it is. We need the human waste to create a form of fertilizer for the baby trees. Now, obviously, if you want this here to function correctly, we need it to be far away from the people. So obviously, it won't start on the side of the development of whatever city we're making. We'll start it further on down the opposite side where the agriculture occurs. So you're obviously going to have your idea of the city. You have a 10-kilometer block for the sake of agriculture. You have a 1-kilometer block for the sake of people living. They may not seem that big in size, but they are plenty big. Over time, you may be able to expand them, but that's after your projects reach crazy figures. The profits that's generated in a city might be able to counteract the cost of that city in 10 years. It still is a negative for 10 years, but after the 10th year, you'll start to see profits flowing in, and your old cost that was there, the couple $100 billion that was invested, will now become money that came out over 10 years, and you'll start seeing a profit coming out of it. And then 10 years later, you're going to have to maintain the city. It's going to be quite a heavy cost that goes into maintenance of the city, and you keep repeating that cycle for the next 100 years, at which point we need newer technologies to upgrade the cities correctly so that they don't go into a state of disrepair. Whew. Okay, so that was just the idea for reclaiming that part of the problem. Now, reclaiming the environment, you're using the human feces as a way of planting on the land. You're going to create sprinkler systems and irrigation from the desalinated water. This is actually where a possible green solution comes out to play. This here is done before your project is actually completed, because you actually want to complete your border, which is 10 kilometers by 10 kilometers, before the city is fully developed for people and before the plant-based situation is completed. So about a 500 to 600 meters of feces needs to be purchased from the governments. They most probably would give it for free. I doubt they will charge you to actually take waste which they need to dump in the ocean and use it for reclaiming land. It actually should count as something they pay you for. I'm not sure which way it would work for a lot of the countries. But nonetheless, at this point, you now can plant trees on the edge of your cities. So everything that you have is now bordered by plants. That 10 kilometer and 1 kilometer are now bordered by plants. You can have your highway leading out of it. It's a nice straight road. Everything is being planted along the side of it. It stinks a lot because it's obviously being made out of waste. And as time passes by, you're going to start moving further and further out. As you start moving out, by the time the agriculture sector has reached its third or fourth year, it should be about a quarter of the reclamation and building put up at that point. the amount of reclamation of land that you should have should mean that that city should pay zero taxes. Whoever invested should be paying zero taxes from it, because at this point the reclamation and the amount of positive you are doing against those countries' greenhouse emissions is actually counting towards a positive for you. Even though you're doing development in those places, you're still getting a positive. Now, once you have reclaimed a complete desert, this year will take decades. It could take 2 or 3 decades for you to completely reclaim a desert. But once you have completely reclaimed a desert like Sahara, for example, you can go all the way from start to end, reclaim the complete desert. All of your agriculture is in. The projects are going. Actually, my calculations are for a 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer, but I've been mentioning the 10 kilometer by accident. So yeah, the 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer is your food range and how much you have there. In terms of the cities for these locations that are in the Saharan desert on the west coast, the low-lying areas, you're looking at very small populations, under 10 million people. Uh, about a 3 city block skyscraper setup would be more than enough for them. One skyscraper as a complete commercial sector for them would be more than enough. And if you keep expanding it out to about a 500 or 600 meter location, it will become a really vibrant city with a lot of people in a very small amount of space. You could actually have a lot of people sustained in that space by counting on other projects to feed the economy within it. Obviously, as I said, the primary is reclaiming the environment. This is all about reclaiming the environment, but I'm giving a solution for countries to actually reclaim a profit while reclaiming the environment and helping their people grow with businesses. Now, an idea of this size and magnitude is crazy to think about on the start, but here's how cheap it could actually start. You could start off with small mobile greenhouses on the coast of these deserts. They can cost you the complete setup with the CETOs, if I'm correct, about $10 million. $10 million and a large, cheap setup for the start before you put in any types of foundations, any type of heavy work, will cost you somewhere in the region of 10-20 million. So you're looking at about a 30 million construction for the start. $30 million to start this year, and you can start pulling profits out of your minimalistic impacts that you have put in. You can use scaffolding instead of using a full building system inside, and you can use robotics, and people can move around the items because you don't have the full impact of a city as yet. Once you've generated some money out of it and you can see that there's a positive outcome from it, honestly, for a big company to actually invest 35 or 45 million into a small project and see whether they can pull out a profit in the small scale is worth it. If they pull out their profit, then they can keep developing and going bigger and bigger until they can pull out the money. Right? Same thing for the governments. They can look at how these projects go and how the impacts start pulling people into the area. As I said, affirmative action should not be used for this year because you want the best of the best in there. The reason is you can have a farmer who can look after 10 kilometers of land. He's a good farmer. You can have a botanist who knows how to handle hydroponics, and the difference between the two is the farmer only knows how to handle land. The botanist knows how to handle the hydroponics. They're going to make sure that system is working fine, and for the first 5 years they are in charge of the project. When the next person comes in, the farmer who looked after 10 kilometers worth of land all on his own, he comes in, he learns how to look after hydroponics. The education time is very short because he is an educated individual in that field. Everything becomes shorter. The role is passed on to the next person. The impact on the jobs is reduced. The amount of land that's being reclaimed out there in the natural environment is going to make a difference. Obviously, that means more animals are going to be able to be reared and looked after as well in those natural environments. Some farmers are not going to agree to these types of systems. It's going to become too expensive for them over time if you keep up with the green initiatives, because their cost just drives down really fast in the start. Taxes have to drive them up. That's the only way that you drive up those costs. Okay, so that is the entire plan for reclaiming the environment. Now, obviously, there's tons more that goes into it. There's the whole possibility of developing those societies as both an underground and overground society. So underground, more living space for people, more place to develop, more food. You can turn that 50 kilometer there are 25 kilometers of arable land in a 10-kilometer stretch. Oh no, wait, that's a 1 kilometer stretch. My mistake. You can turn that 1 kilometer of arable land into another 25 down, so you get 50 out of what is supposed to be 50. But that's because you've reclaimed below the surface, where you don't have that much of an impact. You aren't really stopping the environment from working by going below if you're in the right situation. If you look through and sonogram your land and you make sure that your impacts are outside of their natural water channels, you aren't hitting aquifers, you aren't destroying aquifers, you make the environment a lot more sustainable for you as well in this way, and your society can keep growing even further. This means that where we have problems for society with population growth, where we estimate that our population can only double 2 more times before we run out of usable land, this type of a situation can extend that figure to 40 or 50 doubles before we out of arable land. And to think about that as a solution gives us a couple 100 years to sort out our social environmental issues, because at that point we can think about going out into space, living in space in societies. That's a whole other topic. That's actually something that I'd love to try and forward towards in the future if I can ever get to that point. But I hope that somebody does take this message, and if you do want more of the information, drop a message here. I'm more than willing to talk. I'll talk to you about as much as I can, and hopefully a project like this here can start up of anybody. Honestly, if anybody can just start up something, even if it is the smallest, if you can get Synergy to try and help out with the project and they give you minimalistic costing on their products, that's if they are willing to do it after all that they've been through. If they're willing to give you minimalist costing, and you can pull off one of these greenhouses and make it a profitable situation, make it a growing situation where it will take you 10 years to completely cover the cost of it, or 20 years to cover the cost of it, you can always count it out against a loan when you show that there's profit being made. And that could be an individual small scale business startup. Obviously it takes a lot for a person to be able to do it, as I was saying. The way that I've put it right now makes it very simple in explanation, but hopefully this year comes out to be a lot better down the line. So thank you all for listening to my ramblings for the past 30 to 40 minutes, and I hope that you all do take this seriously and try to better our environment. This is Elementary signing out, hoping that somebody does take this message seriously.